This is East Idaho Newsmakers with Nate Eaton.
Thanks for being with us today. We are talking with the McCandless family from Blackfoot, Idaho. We have the mother, Angela, here with us, along with Jay, who is the father, and Wyatt, who is one of the sons. We are discussing an important issue today, mental illness and crime. One of these things the two items that often go together, but don't really fit together in many cases, and we're going to explore that as we talk with the McCandless family today. Angela, first of all, tell me why you're here. What is your story?
Well, we're here because of our son, and he has a mental illness, and we were trying to get help for Dillon before this crime happened. And we had gone to the prosecutor in Bingham County because we were concerned about him and what might be coming, because we knew his illness was getting worse. And we were told that there was nothing that they could do for us because he was not a danger to himself or others yet. And so this occurred, and then the events just continued to get worse. He didn't get any help while he was incarcerated. And that's why we're here. We want others to know that it's difficult to get help for those who are mentally ill.
Last year, Dillon walked into the Sage Hill Casino on the Fort Hall Reservation and robbed the casino. Because it happened in a casino, it's a federal crime, versus as if it had happened in Idaho Falls or Pocatello, we would be talking maybe about different sentencings and whatnot. But he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, right?
Right.
So, Jay, you knew before this, before he committed the crime, that he was having schizophrenia, right? Having mental illness.
Yes. In 2014, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at the state hospital. Dr. Allness was the doctor there and treated him, put him on medication, and we thought that was all he needed. But we find out later, being amateurs, not having had experience with mental illness, especially with schizophrenia, and what you need to do to follow up with that. So the last time he saw a psychiatrist was shortly after his time in the state hospital. He saw another psychiatrist, and but that's all that he's had. It's difficult to get somebody with that illness help because they don't recognize they have a problem. That's probably part of the big problem with schizophrenia is there's no self-realization for a lot of them. They assume that all the thoughts they have, they're real, they're just as valid as thoughts they had in the past or than any other people's thoughts. And so it's hard to get them help because they don't recognize that. And so getting him back to a doctor for help was impossible. We at times had to go to doctors by ourselves, explain what the symptoms were, what was happening, see if we could get adjustments to medications and things like that. But he really needed some help from a mental health professional that was good at diagnosing, recognizing what the symptoms are, recognizing what's happening, and treating it that way. That's the real challenge that we've seen.
When did you all first realize that he was having some mental issues? I mean, was he a young child? Was he always different than your other kids? What kind of spurred your thought into something's not right?
He was a great kid. He was active, busy, happy, tons of friends. Was a great athlete. He had a great future ahead of him. And this hit him at about age 22, right during the prime of his life. He was actually running his own business and doing great. And then we started seeing odd things happen. And he started believing that he was being recorded, and was always telling us we were recording him. And just some strange things like that. Maybe Wyatt can...
I ask because there's a lot of people out there that may be wondering, I think my child, what's wrong? And did it come suddenly, or was it over a period of time?
I think it was over a period of time. After he was diagnosed in 2014, at least for me, and I don't know about for my parents, but it was kind of an aha moment, like, wow, some of the things that he's done in the past maybe make a little bit more sense to us now. Like, why are you acting this way? you know, he'd had some trouble with the law, minor things when he was younger. But once he got that diagnosis, it just all made sense. And I would say maybe about the year leading up to him getting diagnosed, things were really bad. He had been abusing drugs and alcohol, and we were, you know, kind of at our wits' end. What do we do with him? You know, pardon my French, but he was making our lives hell in a lot of ways. Once he got that medication in the state hospital, things improved a whole bunch. And so we were like, yeah, that was definitely the cause of all this behavior.
So he was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 2014. He's given the medication, and you noticed that those meds help.
Yeah.
They make a difference.
They helped a lot. He came out of there and was doing great, and we thought, oh man, that's all he needed was that medication. He's going to be fine. And he went for a whole year holding a job and doing well, and we were so grateful. Then all of a sudden, like most people, they think they're cured and they want to go off that medication. And so that's what happened. He went off of it, and then all the symptoms came back. And so we knew, you know, he was not cured by any means. He needed that medication. But the medication, of course, makes you depressed. And he said he felt like he was walking in cement all the time. He hated the medication. So he wanted to stay off of it. And he did. He went off of it again. He was pretty medication compliant because I made him take it every night, but he still hated that. And he was off of it when this happened. Not for long, but he'd been off of it for about 5 days.
So he would kind of go on and off it.
He'd only done that, he did that once, and we got him back on it. He had to take a leave of absence from work during that time, so it takes a while to get it back in your system, but yes.
So he goes off it for 5 days in 2017. Did he have any sort of, you mentioned some minor crimes, but he goes into this casino and robs them. How did you all find out?
Facebook.
It was on, it was a news feed, I think, of the Post Register had put out something, and my son-in-law had read it Sunday morning, and he says, that sounds like Dillon.
But he wasn't named yet.
No, they didn't know.
They were looking for him.
And we figured it out, and they says, it's got to be Dillon. So Wyatt called Bingham County Sheriff's Office and told them, and I called Fort Hall Dispatch and told them who they were looking for. And at that point, the law enforcement just kind of backed off, knowing at that point who they were looking for. And so and then we waited, he'd had his phone shut off, and eventually turned it back on and made some calls home that we knew something wasn't right. Even before this had happened that night, Angela had been sending him texts. We constantly had to stay in touch with him and try to give him guidance continually, because even for the months prior to this happening, we could tell things weren't right. We could tell the medication wasn't working right, that his behavior was such that Angela had called the state hospital, and they kept a record that we had called because we asked about what we could do to get him back in there. We'd also called, was it District 7 Mental Health, before even, and to see if there was anything they could do. And unless an individual in Idaho, and this is a really tough thing for the mentally ill, is Dillon not recognizing that there was something wrong, had no reason to want to get help. He was working, he was hauling fuel in like 18-wheelers plus, going from state to state here in the western United States. He was holding a job, but he was changing jobs. And so to prove that he was a danger to himself or others, or do the steps necessary to get him help, was almost impossible. In Idaho, if you can't prove that you're a danger to yourself or someone else, or gravely disabled, they won't just take you and put you somewhere just because your parents say so. And so somewhat law enforcement's hands are tied unless the law has changed. In other countries, they have sometimes better laws to where it allows you to get someone help that may not realize they need help. And that's kind of where we think things ought to go for certain people. Obviously that could be abused by some, but I think for the most part it's pretty genuine, and we've been through the court process to involuntarily commit him once. And it was really expensive because he had to when we first got him committed, he had to do something to break the law to where they could actually take him, put him in behavioral health. And during that time, it's very expensive. Fortunately, we had insurance. He was young enough that he was on our insurance still. But we had planned this. We'd talked to the prosecutor at Bingham County. We'd talked to law enforcement and said, if these things happen, then you will have to come help us. And so there was kind of a altercation at home. We called law enforcement. They came and got him. They were really great to work with, Bingham County Sheriff's deputies. They came and helped us. They got him they first, I believe, took him to the jail and then eventually to Behavioral Health Center. Is that correct? And during that time, he spent some time there waiting until he could have a hearing with the court, because they have to have a competency hearing. And we saw the judge, had to give testimony and say things in front of him. And he still at that point didn't believe there was anything wrong with him. After that happened, there was still a waiting period to get him into the state hospital, because the state hospital has such a limited number of beds. I believe right now they're 20 beds short of just people that are committed there by the courts, and they don't have room for them. And so it was really expensive. The insurance bill just to hold him without giving him treatment, not in the state hospital, but elsewhere, was unreal. You would be surprised what your insurance, you can just about eat up your insurance benefit just holding them until you can get them some help.
Get them actual help.
Yeah, it's not a good process, and it's pretty traumatic for them, because they're being held, they're not medicated, they want to know why they're locked up without any help, and they're kind of angry with the family. And so there's some real challenges. So this next time around when we talk to
so let me cut in here. He was found. He committed the crime. He was found. He was arrested. This is when you start the process working with the prosecutor. Is that when you guys walked in and said, he's mentally ill?
We actually went to his attorney, and
They
they had
court-appointed attorney?
Yes,
Okay.
a federal attorney, and said, we explained the whole situation, said, we need to get our son some help. And he said, we don't help people here. Had he not committed the crime on the Indian reservation, it would have been tried in a state court. They have mental health courts, the states do, but the federal government doesn't.
Which are pretty successful in a lot of cases.
Yes, we understand that.
There's nothing like that in the federal system. No mental health court, nothing.
So they don't take anything into consideration, and they have a set of laws, and they treat you just like you're anybody else. Whether you are mentally ill or not, you get treated just like the next guy. Just because, and even though we tried to get him help, there was almost zero bearing in the case to help him. And in fact, when we talked to him, we didn't like the answer that the defense counsel for him gave us, and so we thought, well, let's see if the prosecutor's any different. So we talked to the federal prosecutor. He wanted to have Dillon's counsel there, and so at the same time we rehearsed the same thing to both of them again. And following that, Dillon was sent for a mental competency evaluation, and that went to San Diego. So here's a guy that's medication's not working well. They take him from Jefferson County, they move him over a several month period to get him to San Diego. So
they actually took him to San Diego.
He had 6 moves before he got to San Diego. And
6 moves to different jails.
Not before he had 3 moves to get to San Diego, and then 3 moves to get back home, all dropping off at different places, which is stressful on the normal person.
But you take somebody that's paranoid, they're schizophrenic, and they have problems, and he did have problems on the way. And when he was there, they determined his competence. He was competent, and we knew he was competent in that we knew he could understand things. It doesn't mean when you have schizophrenia that you're you have any type of really mental retardation or anything like that. It doesn't have anything to do with intellect. But at the time of the crime, we don't think he was competent. But at the time that he went for his hearing, they found him competent. But if he didn't, excuse me, take the medications that were required, he could lose, he could become incompetent, and that did happen.
Why didn't they just do the evaluation here?
I wish they would have, instead of taking him.
Well, you would
dropping
think
him
that
off.
would save money.
Oh, yes, and they, by the time he got back, he was even worse. His health had deteriorated, and he had lost 45 pounds. He was very sick, and mental health had to be called into where he was being held to see him, because he was isolating himself, because he was paranoid and didn't want to go out in the general population. So he just continued to deteriorate, was in being incarcerated.
So they found him competent, meaning, sorry, we're not going to do anything.
Well, not really. They just simply said, you're able to understand the charges against you, and you're able to kind of help in your defense. That's all they're saying.
That's what that meant.
They're not saying you don't have a mental illness. They're just saying you can kind of help yourself, just like any other person could. But and so at the competency hearing on January 18th, the judge ordered the prosecutor and the defense counsel to work together and get him a psychiatrist to make sure that he stayed competent, because the judge didn't want to have to go through this again where he was found incompetent. And so he says, get him a psychiatrist and make sure that medication's regulated. Well, even though the judge gave the order, it never happened. And Dillon's attorney, when we asked, why haven't you got him a psychiatrist? He said, the U.S. Marshals refused to pay for it. But we doubt that that really occurred, that it was almost like his attorney didn't recognize him as having a mental illness, so he made the determination that he wasn't going to get him any help, which he did not. And so while our son was incarcerated in the Minnecaja Criminal Justice Center in Burley, he had some problems, and we requested help multiple times to get him help. And it didn't happen. And while he was there, while he was having one of his episodes, the medications they had, I'll back up, the medications they had prescribed and put him on in San Diego, he took himself off there. They did not have a mental health professional to make sure his medication was what he needed. And so he re-prescribed for himself what he wanted to take. You have a mentally ill person who is delusional, paranoid, has not been to medical school or pharmacy school, saying, this is what I want to take.
And he's telling this to the jail.
He's telling this to medical at the jail.
And they're just giving it to him?
That's what happened. And so they're prescribing, and they don't know what dose to prescribe at. And so his dosages were not even in the range of being an antipsychotic, at the range they were giving it to him most of the time on one certain medication.
And Wyatt, you told us a few weeks ago that during this, I believe during this period, he was getting into altercations in jail, and at one point he had to be tasered.
Yeah, this was probably a month leading up to the sentencing. He started having some serious problems, and my mom got a call one night from one of the inmates in the jail, his cellmate, to tell her that he'd been in an altercation with a jailer or an officer in the jail, and he'd been put in isolation because of that. We didn't know many details, and subsequently being locked in isolation, and some of the details are a little bit foggy, but he had other altercations with guards as well, where he was tasered, I believe, 4 times. And because of that, he fell and broke his shoulder. So.
Did you find any help anywhere?
None. There was one. There was when Dillon had this altercation and had the problems at Burley, we talked to the prosecutor there by the name of Doug Abendroth, really a good guy. He was sympathetic, understood Dillon needed help. They were willing to step in and pay the cost of having Dillon sent to the state hospital or some other mental facility to get his medications regulated because they could see he was out of control. Before this had happened, he'd broke his foot. They kind of self-destruct. He broke his foot, he broke his hand in this altercation. His shoulder was broken 3 places. All of these things happened, and he's like, Doug Abendroth's like, we will get him some help. But the problem they ran into was he was in the custody of the U.S. Marshals, and they refused to allow him to be moved anywhere. They had charged him in the jail with 4 felonies, and we were actually pleased because we thought, okay, now he's proved he's a danger to other people again. The state can step in, get him some help that we've asked for, but the marshals refused to allow him to be moved. All that happened was after that, they put him in isolation again, which is not helpful. They didn't get his medication figured out. We still had amateurs doing it. And he then, at that point, he tried to kill himself. He started cutting himself up with a razor. And they then transported him to the hospital there in Burley and took care of his wounds and then transported him back to jail. But at that point, still, no one had stepped in to help him with his mental illness. This is a guy where it's unbelievable. The state, or I should say the counties there at that point, was willing to pay for him to get help, and the feds still would not allow it.
And at one point, are you guys like, well, where do we go? Who do you go to?
We made some phone calls. We talked, we called the judge, we called the prosecutor, we called his attorney without any luck at all. It was amazing.
The next thing we know is that he's in court being sentenced. And I read a 15-minute statement about everything we had done to try to get him help. My husband talked, and the next thing we know, he's sentenced to 9 years.
In federal prison.
Yeah.
Set.
Yes.
Because, again, it's a federal crime. A lot of times in the local jurisdictions, you can plea deal or
Right.
They seem more helpful. So, in your statements, did you talk about mental illness?
Yes.
And what was there any sort of response, any sort of reaction?
The judge, he said, what really should be happening here is this guy shouldn't be going to jail. He should be going to some mental health care facility to get fixed. But he says, we don't have that option in the federal system, and my hands are tied. And because my hands are tied, he's going to go to prison. And that's all it was. It was just amazed us that even when the people like his attorney or the prosecutor could have helped, they didn't help. And
When that order was given in court back in January for him to get a psychiatrist, and if that order would have been followed and they would have got him that psychiatrist who was seeing him on a regular basis and monitoring his medications, we wouldn't be in this situation where he has lasting injuries now and tried to kill himself and everything else. But that order was just ignored.
And the reason they're telling you, the reason they told you was because the U.S. Marshals wouldn't pay for it.
Right.
But according to the U.S. Attorney, Bart Davis, he told us if a judge orders that be done, it should have been done. And I almost, it was like the people at the jail misled the marshals, and the marshals passed bad information on to the prosecutor. And then Dillon's attorney, he I don't think recognized that Dillon was ill. And because he didn't know him and he didn't know the symptoms and he didn't spend a lot of time talking to him, he wouldn't have necessarily recognized it. He might have just thought, these people they're just whining about their boy because he's in trouble and they're trying to get him out of trouble, and so they'll say anything. And so Dillon never got the help, and I don't think they recognized that he was really ill until he had these episodes in the jail when Cassia County wanted to put him in a mental facility, because they said, we are not capable of taking care of him either medically or mentally. And so the Fed's plan was, instead of getting him help, all they did was moved up his sentencing date, which means we didn't get a chance to look at the pre-sentence investigation and rebut anything in there. And that's the interesting thing, is there were things that were said by the judge that were not totally accurate. We didn't get Dillon's medical records until after sentencing. And if you were to look at things that the judge said and compared them with medical records, there was another story to be told. They were saying he wasn't medication compliant, but he took his medication at night. There were times when there were 11 days they missed unexplained why they didn't give him an antipsychotic at night. There were times it took him 4 months to figure out that he couldn't wake up in the morning to take his medications in the morning, but he took his antipsychotics at night. So part of the judge's sentencing was, you don't take your medicines like you're supposed to, but after 4 months they realized this guy isn't waking up in the morning, meds aren't right, and so let's give them to him in the evening when he's awake. And if you would have had a psychiatrist, a professional that understood this, a lot of that could have been avoided. And they didn't, their medical was not very well prepared to handle it. With his broken foot, they looked at his broken foot and said, it'll heal. And it did, and incorrectly. It was broken 2 places. It took 60 days to get an x-ray. His hand was broken, and the one lady in the jail said, no, and she was almost kind of vindictive. She was like, no, or because he acted and hurt himself and didn't admit to it, it was like no x-ray ordered. But 2 days later, another medical person came in and said, that hand's got deformity, we're getting an x-ray. And how long did it take to get that x-ray?
It took over 3 weeks to get that x-ray.
So it healed incorrectly. And then his shoulder, when it got broke with the altercation with, how many days did that wait before?
That was another week.
It was a week, and then it was x-ray.
Nothing's been fixed.
And so his shoulder was damaged, and the doctor said, we can't do anything with him. He's too out of it. He needs a CT scan. I don't know if it's an MRI or what, to see if there's soft tissue damage in his shoulder, but nothing, if you can believe it, has been done to this date. And the medication he's on is still the medication he prescribed, only
for himself.
5 times, only at 5 times the rate he was on at the day of his sentencing. At the day of his sentencing, he was on 100 milligrams, and today he's on 500. It's just hard to believe that it's that hard to get him help.
Obviously, the system is broken. I mean, in major ways, the prison system, and then you add in mental illness, which people are still trying to understand, and funding, and you hear stories like this, and you know there's other families watching that say, that sounds like me, that sounds like us. So he's in prison for 9 years. Is he going to get any help for the next 9 years?
That's what we're working on. That's the big reason we're trying to raise awareness that this is such a huge issue. Is, hopefully it'll catch the attention of somebody who's in a position of authority enough that maybe they can get the ball rolling and have some changes made. Even, the goal is to get my brother the help he needs. We've never once said, yeah, he shouldn't pay for this crime. It was clearly something he did that affected other people, and he needs to pay for it, but he needs to have serious mental care. And we know that we're not alone, that if he's getting treated this way or not getting treated, there's other people that are having the same thing happen to them. And if this can help them, if we can raise awareness and get things changed to help other people, it's just as worth it.
And it's not like you're petitioning to have him free.
No.
It's just to make sure he's taken care of with basic medication and evaluations.
By a professional.
By a professional, not himself, not prescribing himself the drugs.
Our argument is, what good is 9 years in prison going to do for a guy who's schizophrenic and doesn't receive any treatment, any type of therapy to teach him coping skills or teach him to recognize triggers when he might be going to have an episode? You're going to end up with a guy that's even more broken and damaged if he makes it through his prison sentence, comes on the outside, and he's going to be a repeat offender and either hurt himself or somebody else again, more than likely, because they're just ruined.
Trying to fix it now when it's a problem rather than a massive problem in 9 years. Looking back now, you've explained, what's happened, but what are 2 or 3 or 4 things that, had simple things been done, could have maybe helped, or could have at least put your mind a little bit more at ease?
I would say that if someone in authority would really study and learn about schizophrenia and find out that these people aren't able to help themselves, that there is something that the law can do to step in and help them. When there's family that are concerned, they ought to do it. A lot of families become discouraged and they give up on the person that's ill and they become homeless. And so when you have somebody like our family that cares about our son and we have him at home, we ought to be listened to, and there ought to be some kind of a change to the law, some exception where you're not so concerned about you're concerned about the person's rights, but yet at the same time you have to balance that with, does the person, is he able to help with his illness or not? And if they're not able to help with their illness, the family's concerns ought to be considered and help ought to be gotten. And we feel like had we got Dillon help before this robbery, chances are he wouldn't have committed the robbery. And it would have saved the taxpayers a lot of money, a lot of hassle. We're worried that when he comes out, he's going to be a lot worse off than he is now. And we're the ones that are planning on taking care of him. And that's just going to make it a lot harder for us in the future, and probably a lot harder on society too.
And it's got to be excruciating to watch your son and brother knowing that if he were out, you could be helping him, you could be doing that, but at this point, you know, your hands are kind of tied. What is you're raising awareness, you're speaking out today. Didn't you launch a website or a blog?
Yeah, a blog.
What's the next step? I mean, do you plan to meet with lawmakers? Do you plan to, you know, fighting a federal program can be pretty tough, or not fighting it, but trying to change laws and things like that. But is that your goal? Is that your intent?
Yeah, I would say overall that would be the ultimate goal, is that there's some changes made to laws. If the opportunity presented itself to meet with, you know, lawmakers and tell them our story, sure. If it would help further that cause, yes, most definitely.
We are still attempting at this time to get him help. So we've made an appointment to visit with the U.S. Attorney for the state of Idaho, Bart Davis, and we're going to go meet with him on Monday, still just to try to get Dillon help, just to get him help still. We've been unsuccessful in the past year to get him a psychiatrist that was ordered by the court. He's got a lot more pull than we do. I believe the people are going to listen to him, and we're really hoping that we're still hoping that we can get a professional to him, because he's got a foot that the bone grew together wrong, his hand has grown together wrong, he still hasn't had his shoulder looked at.
I think another thing too, along with those lines, in the course of starting this blog and some Facebook posts that I made, kind of explaining the situation, I was reached out to by tons of people from all over the country, mostly here locally, but I mean, I had people from Mississippi, North Carolina sending me messages saying, we know what you're going through, we have a son, or we have a relative or a friend that had schizophrenia or had a mental illness and was in trouble with the law. And a lot of them, sadly, the story they tell me is that they took their own life. And we know we're not alone. There's other people out there. And I think we just want to encourage people, write your legislators, you know, send messages to your representatives, tell them how you feel about this, and hopefully we can see some change.
Everybody watching knows someone with mental illness, and if you think you don't, you're wrong, because it is much more prevalent than you think. And in most cases, when someone breaks a foot, it's fixed right away. But when someone has schizophrenia, it's, well, okay, in a lot of cases, we're not going to do anything. Well, thank you all for speaking out. We'll continue to follow it, because we want to see where this goes, and hopefully you can make change with us. So Angela, Jay, Wyatt McCandless, their brother and son Dillon, do you know where he'll be serving his time?
We don't even know that. They told us they would ship him off shortly, but we don't know where.
So it could be anywhere,
right,
in the country. Well, best of luck in your effort. And again, if you want more information on this story and their project, we will link to your blog down in the story below. And thank you for watching. Have a good week.